The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a jagged physical thing tearing through the pines of the Bitterroot Mountains, stripping bark and burying trails under 6 feet of powder. Most folks died in a whiteout like this. They froze or they panicked, or the mountain simply swallowed them whole. Christian knew the math of the cold. He was waiting it out, a solitary man in a buried cabin. Then came the sound. Too rhythmic for a branch, too heavy for the wind. Someone was knocking on his door. The iron stove in the corner of the cabin radiated a dry, desperate heat, but it barely touched the frost, creeping up the inside of the window panes. Christian Lawson sat by the hearth. He held a piece of oiled leather in his hands, working a thick needle through a busted saddle strap. His hands were mapped with pale scars, thick from years of gripping axes, skinning knives and reins. Outside, the blizzard howled. It had been dropping snow for 3 days. The world beyond the heavy timber walls of his cabin was a white void. Nothing survived out there. Then the thud. Christian froze. The needle paused midway through the leather. He tilted his head, listening past the roar of the wind in the chimney. Thud. Weaker this time. Down low near the base of the heavy oak door. It wasn't the wind. The wind battered. It didn't knock. Christian set the leather aside. He stood up his joints, popping in the quiet room. He didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the wall. If someone was out there in this storm, they weren't a threat. They were a corpse, looking for a warm place to drop. He pulled back the iron bolt. The wind instantly ripped the door from his grip, throwing it open with a violent crack against the interior wall. A blinding wall of snow blasted into the room, extinguishing the oil lamp on the table. Christian threw up an arm to shield his face, squinting into the whiteout. There was nothing on the porch. He leaned out, the cold biting through his flannel shirt like a spray of needles. He looked left, right. Nothing but drifts. He was about to haul the door shut, cursing himself for hearing ghosts, when he saw the dark shape, half buried in the snowdrift against the porch railing. It was small, a pile of snow-caked wool and canvas. Christian stepped out into the knee-deep snow on the porch. The cold seized his lungs. He reached down and grabbed a fistful of the heavy coat, pulling the shape upward. It was a person. Dead weight. He hauled the body up, wrapping his arms around a slender waist, and dragged them backward over the threshold. He slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, leaning his weight against the wood as the wind outside shrieked in protest. The cabin was suddenly plunged back into its dim, smoky quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Christian turned to the bundle on the floor. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight, fetal knot. Snow clung to her eyelashes, her hair, and the rough wool of a men's coat that was 3 sizes too big for her. Her lips were blue. Not pale, but a bruised, terrifying violet. Christian didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, pulling off his heavy leather gloves. He rolled her onto her back. Her head lolled. Her breathing was so shallow it barely moved the fabric of her coat. "Hey," he said, his voice gravelly from days of disuse. He tapped her cheek. Her skin felt like river stone. "Hey, wake up." Nothing. He went to work. He stripped off her frozen leather mittens. Her fingers were white, stiff as kindling. He unbuttoned the heavy coat, his numb fingers fumbling with the ice-encrusted toggles, and pulled it off her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a woolen sweater and a simple mud-stained dress. Her boots were completely encased in ice. He drew his hunting knife from his belt and carefully sliced the laces, pulling the stiff leather off her feet, followed by 2 pairs of soaked woolen socks. He checked her toes. Pale but not black yet. The frostbite hadn't completely set in, but it was close. Christian stood, grabbed a wool blanket from his cot, and laid it out near the stove. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, hollowed out by whatever journey had brought her to his doorstep. He laid her on the blanket. He fetched a basin of lukewarm water from the stove reservoir, not hot, would destroy the frozen tissue, and began to gently rub her hands and feet. As the ice melted from her hair, it revealed a mess of dark auburn waves. Her face was sharp, aristocratic almost, but hollowed by exhaustion. A dark purple bruise blossomed along her left cheekbone, stark against her bloodless skin. Someone had hit her. Recently. Christian stared at the bruise. The mountain didn't do that. He spent the next 2 hours in a silent, grueling battle against the cold. He massaged her limbs to force the blood back into the veins. When she finally groaned a small, ragged sound from the back of her throat, Christian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Her eyelids fluttered. They opened to reveal eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. They were wild, unfocused, panicked. She violently jerked her hand away from his. "Don't!" She rasped, her voice tearing. She tried to scramble backward away from the stove, away from him. "Stop!" Christian said. He held up his hands, palms open. He stayed crouched, keeping his frame small. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. You nearly froze to death on my porch." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the fire, then at the heavy timber walls, then back to his face. She took in his bearded jaw, his broad shoulders, the hunting knife still resting on the floor beside him. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She was shivering violently now, a good sign. It meant her body was trying to generate heat. "Who?" She started, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the word. "Christian Lawson," he said. He picked up a tin cup, dipped it into a pot of broth simmering on the edge of the stove, and held it out to her. "Drink this. It'll warm your core." She didn't take the cup. She just stared at him, with that same feral, cornered look. "I'm not going to hurt you," Christian said quietly. He set the cup on the floorboards between them. "But if you don't drink that, you might die anyway. And I just spent 3 hours thawing you out. Don't waste my evening." He stood up, turning his back on her to give her space, and walked over to the window. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying whatever tracks she had left. Whoever she was running from, they weren't coming tonight. Behind him, he heard the faint scrape of tin on wood. He listened as she picked up the cup and took a slow, trembling sip. Morning came, not with sunlight, but with a dull grey diffusion through the frosted glass. The storm had lost its scream, settling into a heavy, relentless snow that muffled the world. Christian was awake before dawn. He always was. He lay on a pallet of furs near the door, having surrendered his cot to the woman. He listened to her breathe. It was deeper now, more regular. The ragged catch in her chest was gone. He rose silently. He built up the fire, added a few split logs of dry pine, and set the coffee pot on the iron plate. The smell of roasted grounds and wood smoke filled the small space. It was a familiar, solitary smell. The presence of another person in the room changed the gravity of the cabin. It made the walls feel closer. He was slicing a block of salt pork when he heard the rustle of wool. He didn't turn around. "Coffee's almost boiling," he said. Silence. Then the creak of the bed ropes. "Where am I?" Her voice was clearer today. Still raw, but the panic had dialed down to a cautious wariness. "Bitterroot Mountains, about 20 miles north of the nearest settlement," Christian said. He tossed the thick slices of meat into a cast-iron skillet. They hissed, spitting grease. "You're lucky you stumbled this way. Nothing else out here but rocks and bears." He wiped his hands on a rag and finally turned to look at her. She was sitting up on the edge of the cot. She had the heavy quilt pulled up to her chin. In the grey morning light, the bruise on her cheek was a vivid, ugly yellow purple. She looked around the cabin, her eyes darting over the rifles mounted on the wall, the drying pelts, the neatly stacked firewood. It was a brutal, pragmatic space. There was nothing soft in it. "I need to leave," she said. She swung her legs off the bed. She tried to stand. Her legs gave out instantly. She collapsed toward the floorboards. Christian crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her by the shoulders before she hit the ground. He hauled her back onto the edge of the cot. She felt fragile, bird-boned, but there was a rigid tension in her muscles. She fought his grip for a second before realizing she didn't have the strength. "You're not going anywhere," Christian said, his voice flat. He let go of her and stepped back immediately. "Your muscles are starved. You have mild frost nip on your toes. Outside it's 10 below zero, and the snow is waist deep. You'd make it 50 yards. She gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles white. She stared at the floor. "You don't understand. I can't stay here. The mountain doesn't care what you can or can't do," Christian replied, walking back to the stove. He flipped the salt pork. "You stay, you live. You go, you die. I'll dig a grave in the spring when the ground thaws. Up to you." It was a harsh truth, but Christian didn't believe in sugarcoating survival. He took a tin plate, piled it with the fried pork and a hard biscuit, and brought it to her, along with a cup of black coffee. She looked at the food. Her stomach gave a loud, involuntary rumble. A flush of color touched her pale cheeks. "Eat," he commanded gently. She took the plate. She started slow taking small bites, but the hunger quickly took over. She ate with a desperate efficiency. Christian sat at his small table across the room, nursing his own coffee, watching her. "What's your name?" he asked. She paused, a piece of biscuit halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her eyes guarded. "Addison. Just Addison. Just Addison." Christian nodded. "All right, Addison. Who hit you?" She stopped chewing. She lowered the biscuit to the plate. Her hand went to her cheek, fingers lightly touching the swollen skin beneath her eye. "I fell." "You fell?" Christian repeated. "Yes. On a rock. In the snow." Christian leaned back in his chair. "I've seen men fall down mountainsides. I've seen them kicked by mules and thrown by green horses. That bruise didn't come from a rock. It came from a knuckle." Addison looked away, her jaw tight. "I don't want to talk about it." "Fair enough." Christian stood up, grabbing his heavy canvas coat from a peg. "I'm going to chop wood. Don't touch the rifles. Don't open the door. If you need to relieve yourself, there's a chamber pot behind the screen." He didn't wait for her to answer. He walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The cold outside was a physical weight. Christian grabbed his axe from the block on the porch. He found a rhythm quickly, the sharp thwack of steel, splitting pine ringing out into the muted snowy world. He didn't want to stray in his cabin. He lived out here for a reason. The world down below was loud, complicated, and full of liars. He preferred the honest cruelty of the mountains. But he couldn't leave her out there to die. Whoever she was running from, they were bad enough that she preferred taking her chances in a bitterroot blizzard. That meant they were determined. And determined men left tracks. Christian swung the axe, burying it deep into the woodblock. He had a bad feeling the quiet of his mountain had just been broken for good. 4 days passed. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a sky of impossible blinding blue and a silence so deep it rang in the ears. The snowbanks reached the bottom of the cabin windows. Inside, the space felt smaller by the hour. A quiet routine settled over them, built on necessity, and an unspoken agreement to avoid the past. Addison was stronger now. The color had returned to her face. She insisted on helping. She chopped vegetables when Christian managed to trap a hare. She swept the floorboards. She washed her own clothes in a tin tub by the fire, hanging them on a line strung across the corner of the room. Christian watched her. She was efficient, her movements sharp and deliberate, but she was jumpy. If a log popped violently in the stove, she flinched. If the wind rattled the roof boards, her eyes shot toward the door. One evening, Christian was sitting at the table meticulously cleaning his revolver, the smell of gun oil mixed with the scent of roasted rabbit. Addison was sitting near the stove, a torn piece of one of his old shirts in her lap, awkwardly trying to stitch a seam. She let out a sharp hiss of pain, dropping the shirt. She brought her thumb to her mouth. "Needle bite?" Christian asked, not looking up from the cylinder of his Colt. "I'm not exactly a seamstress," she muttered, inspecting the drop of blood on her thumb. Christian set the gun down. He walked over to a small wooden box on a shelf, pulled out a rag and a small tin of salve, and brought them to her. "Here." She took it, their fingers brushing for a second. His hands were rough, hard as bark. Hers were softer, but he noticed calluses on her palms that didn't match the fine cut of her cheekbones. "Thank you," she said. She rubbed the salve into the tiny puncture. "You know your way around a kitchen, but you can't sew. You wear a man's coat, but have hands that haven't done hard labor until recently." Christian mused aloud, leaning against the heavy timber wall. "You're a puzzle, Addison." She stiffened. "I didn't ask you to solve me." "I don't like puzzles," Christian said smoothly. "I like knowing what's in my cabin, especially when whatever is in my cabin is looking over her shoulder every 5 minutes." Addison looked up at him. The firelight caught the amber in her dark eyes. "I'm grateful to you, Christian. You saved my life. I won't ever forget that. As soon as the snow melts enough to clear the pass, I'll be gone. I won't bring you any trouble." "Trouble doesn't wait for the snow to melt," Christian said. He pointed at her face. The bruise had faded to a sickly yellow, but the swelling was gone. A man who hits a woman hard enough to leave that mark isn't the type to let her just walk away. Addison looked down at the shirt in her lap. Her hands were trembling slightly. "You don't know him." "No, I don't." Christian waited. He didn't push. He knew the value of silence. In the mountains, silence was how you lured things out into the open. A long minute passed. Only the crackle of the fire filled the space. "His name is Emmett," she said softly. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, as if saying the name out loud would summon him through the floorboards. Emmett Caldwell. Christian's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Anyone who spent time in the valley towns knew that name. Caldwell wasn't just a man. He was an industry. Cattle land, the railroad. He owned the local sheriff. He owned the bank. He was a man who took what he wanted and crushed what he couldn't control. "Caldwell," Christian repeated. "You picked a hell of a ghost to run from." Addison let out a bitter, dry laugh. "I didn't pick him. He picked me. I was a ledger clerk at the bank in Helena. I saw things. Money moving where it shouldn't. Deeds being altered." She looked up, her eyes fierce despite the fear in them. "I took the ledgers. I hid them. He found out." "So he hit you to make you talk." She nodded, touching her cheek subconsciously. "He locked me in a room at his ranch, said he was going to break my fingers one by one until I told him where the books were. I managed to slip the window latch when his guard fell asleep. I ran. I didn't know where. I just kept climbing the mountain until the snow blinded me." Christian looked at her. He saw the sheer raw terror of those memories in her posture, but he also saw the steel it took to steal from a man like Caldwell, and the grit it took to run into a blizzard rather than surrender. "You should have let the books go," Christian said bluntly. "No ledger is worth freezing to death. They are if they can stop him from ruining 100 other families. Addison snapped back, her chin raising. He stole farms, Christian. He starved people out. I couldn't just sit there and log the numbers. Christian stared at her. He was a cynic. He believed human nature was inherently selfish, that survival was the only real law. But looking at Addison sitting by his fire in borrowed oversized clothes, bruised but unbroken, he felt a crack in the armor he had built around himself for years. He pushed off the wall and walked back to the table. He picked up his revolver, checked the cylinder one last time, and slammed it shut with a heavy metallic click. The pass won't be clear for 3 weeks. Christian said his back to her as he slid the gun into its holster. If Caldwell realizes you went up the mountain, he'll send men. Men who know how to track in the snow. Addison stood up. Then I should leave now. I won't drag you into this. Christian turned around. He looked at her, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. I told you. You wouldn't make it 50 yards. He grabbed a cloth and began wiping down the table. You stay. You keep chopping the vegetables. And when Caldwell's men come up that trail... He paused, throwing the dirty rag onto a chair. I'll teach you how to shoot. The cold bit at Addison's exposed fingers, but she barely felt it. All her focus was on the heavy slab of iron and oiled wood in her hands. Keep your elbow down, Christian said. His voice was right beside her ear, a low rumble over the hiss of the mountain wind. You stick it out like that, it throws your balance, and it makes you a wider target. They were standing in the snowy clearing behind the cabin. The sun was glaringly bright, reflecting off the drifts and forcing them both to squint. 50 yards away, 3 split logs stood upright in a snowbank. Addison tucked her elbow against her ribs. The Winchester 1873 was heavy, heavier than she expected. It pulled at the muscles in her shoulders, which still ached from hauling firewood 2 days prior. I have it, she muttered. You're squeezing the stock, Christian corrected, stepping into her peripheral vision. He reached out his rough, gloved fingers, tapping her knuckles. Hold it firm, don't strangle it. You fight the rifle, you'll pull the shot. Breathe in. She drew a breath of freezing air. Let half of it out. Hold. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Squeeze. She did as he said. The rifle exploded against her shoulder. The crack of the gunshot was deafening, bouncing off the timberline and echoing down the valley. The recoil kicked her backward, her boots sliding in the packed snow. She stumbled, dropping the barrel toward the ground. 50 yards away, the 3 logs remained completely untouched. Addison swore a sharp, unladylike word that made Christian's eyebrows twitch upward. She rubbed her right shoulder. I missed. By 3 feet. Christian confirmed dryly. He didn't offer sympathy. He reached over and tapped the barrel upward. Chamber another round. She gritted her teeth, gripping the lever action. It was stiff, requiring real force. She yanked it down and snapped it back up. The brass casing flew out, landing hot and smoking in the snow, and a fresh cartridge slid into the breech. Again, Christian said. For 2 hours the mountain echoed with gunfire. Addison missed the logs 20 times. Her shoulder blossomed with a deep, spreading ache. Her hands shook from the cold and the adrenaline. But she didn't ask to stop. Every time she missed, her jaw set a little tighter. She stopped flinching at the noise. She stopped closing her eyes when she pulled the trigger. On the 21st shot, bark exploded from the center log. The silence that followed the gunshot felt different this time. Heavy. Triumphant. Addison lowered the rifle, her chest heaving. She looked at the splintered wood, then turned to Christian. A fierce, breathless smile broke across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It completely changed the geometry of her features, softening the sharp edges of her exhaustion and fear. Christian felt a strange, sudden tightness in his chest. He ignored it. You hit the wood. he said, his tone deliberately flat. But a man isn't a log. A man moves. He shoots back. He screams. Her smile faded, replaced by that familiar, haunted guardedness. The reality of what they were preparing for settled back over them like a shroud. "I know," she said quietly. Christian stepped closer. He took the rifle from her stiff hands, his thumb brushing over hers. The contact was brief, but it lingered. "A gun is just a tool, Addison," he said, staring down at the weapon. "It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't care who is right or who is wrong. The only thing that matters is the person holding it. If you pull this trigger when Caldwell's men come, you can't hesitate. If you hesitate, you die." "I won't hesitate," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was hard as flint. Christian looked at her. He saw the bruise, now a faded yellow shadow on her cheek. He saw the way she stood, shoulders squared, refusing to shrink away from him or the violence he was promising. "Good," he grunted. He turned and started walking back toward the cabin. "Go inside. Warm up. Tomorrow we use the revolver. It kicks worse." That night the cabin felt smaller. The air between them had shifted. It was no longer just the grudging truce of a survivor and a reluctant host. They were bound now by a shared preparation for violence. After dinner, Addison sat by the stove, rubbing her bruised shoulder. Christian watched her from the table. He stood up, went to his shelf, and grabbed a small brown glass bottle. He walked over and handed it to her. "Liniment," he said. "Horse liniment mostly. Smells like camphor and hellfire, but it pulls the ache out of the muscle." She took the bottle, uncorking it. The sharp medicinal smell instantly filled the corner of the room. She hesitated, looking at her heavy woolen shirt. Christian turned his back to her, returning to his chair at the table. He picked up his whetstone and a hunting knife, fixing his eyes on the steel. "I won't look." He heard the rustle of fabric as she unbuttoned the collar of her shirt and pulled it off her shoulder. He heard the soft slick of the liquid on her skin, accompanied by a sharp intake of breath as the liniment burned. "Christian," she asked softly. "Yeah." "Why are you doing this? You could have just let me stay until the thaw and sent me on my way. If they come, you could die because of me." Christian kept his eyes on the knife, dragging the steel across the stone with a rhythmic shk, shk. "My father built this cabin," Christian said. "He came out here to get away from men like Caldwell. Men who think money gives them the right to own the world and everyone in it." He paused, wiping the blade on a cloth. "I don't care about your ledgers. I don't care about the bank. But no man bleeds a woman and tracks her to my door. Not on my mountain." He didn't turn around, but he heard her let out a slow, shaking breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Put your shirt back on." Christian replied, his voice gruff. "We start at dawn." The thaw came ugly. The pristine white of the bitter roots turned to a soggy, treacherous grey. The snowbanks slumped, melting into roaring creeks that tore through the ravines. The air smelled of wet pine mud and decay. It had been 3 weeks since Addison arrived. The pass was opening. Christian was 2 miles south of the cabin, checking a line of snare traps he hadn't visited since the blizzard. The mud sucked at his boots, making every step a labor. He found 2 rabbits, their fur matted and soaked, and strung them to his belt. He was cresting a rocky ridge that looked down into the lower valley when he saw it. It wasn't much, just a smudge. A thin, dirty grey ribbon of smoke snaking up into the pale spring sky about 5 miles down the mountain. Christian dropped to a crouch instantly, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his Colt. He watched the smoke for 10 minutes. It didn't billow like a forest fire. It was steady, controlled. A camp. No trapping parties came up this side of the mountain in the early spring. The mud was too deep, the pelts too thin. Caldwell's men. They had waited for the snow to recede, just enough to push the horses through. Christian calculated the distance and the terrain. The mud would slow them down, but they had a trail to follow now. The meltwater would wash away some tracks, but broken branches and displaced rocks wouldn't hide the fact that someone had come this way. They would reach the cabin by tomorrow afternoon. He stood up, turning his back on the valley, and began the brutal hike home. He didn't run. Running meant sweating, twisting an ankle in the hidden rocks beneath the slush. He moved with a relentless driving purpose. When Christian pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin, the smell of roasted rabbit and dried sage hit him. Addison was at the stove stirring a cast-iron pot. She looked over her shoulder, a greeting forming on her lips, but it died the second she saw his face. Christian didn't say a word. He walked to the corner, dropped the dead rabbits on the floorboards, and went straight to the gun rack. He pulled down the Winchester, checked the action, and set it on the table. He reached up and pulled down a double-barreled shotgun. Addison slowly set the wooden spoon down. She wiped her hands on her apron. Her face drained of the color the stove had given it. "How far?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. 5 miles. Christian said, breaking the shotgun open and inspecting the barrels. "Spotted their fire down in the lower basin. They'll be here tomorrow, assuming they don't break a horse's leg in the mud." He walked over to a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of his bed, threw open the lid and began pulling out boxes of ammunition. Heavy brass cartridges clattered onto the table. "How many?" she asked, stepping closer to the table. Didn't see them, but Caldwell wouldn't send 1 man. 3, maybe 4. Enough to intimidate, not enough to draw attention. Christian looked up at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, the steel he had spent 3 weeks honing. "We have the high ground. The only way up to this cabin is through a narrow bottleneck of pines about 200 yards down the trail. They have to come single file." He slid a box of 44-40 cartridges across the rough wood toward her. "Load the magazines," he ordered. For the next hour they worked in absolute silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic, metallic snick-snick of bullets being thumbed into magazines. They shuttered the windows, bolting the heavy timber covers shut, leaving only narrow slats to shoot through. Christian dragged the heavy oak table to the center of the room, turning it on its side to create a barricade facing the door. The cabin transformed from a sanctuary into a fortress. When the sun finally dropped below the peaks, casting the room into deep, flickering shadows, Christian sat on the floor behind the overturned table. He rested the Winchester across his knees. Addison sat down beside him. She pulled her knees to her chest. She was wearing her own boots now, the leather oiled and softened, and Christian's heavy canvas coat. She held a Colt Navy revolver in her lap. "You don't have to stay here," Addison said into the dark. "You know the mountain. You could slip out the back, hide in the rocks. They just want me." "Shut up, Addison," Christian said, his voice softer than the words implied. She turned her head to look at him. In the dim light of the stove, his profile was a jagged silhouette of beard and bone. "I brought this to your door," she whispered. "You knocked," Christian corrected her, turning his head to meet her gaze. "I opened it. The choice was mine." He reached out his rough hand, covering hers where it gripped the cold steel of the revolver. His grip was warm, steady, anchoring her to the floorboards. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. They sat there in the dark hands, locked over a gun, waiting for the dawn. Dawn didn't arrive with a glorious sunrise. It bled into the sky like a bruised grey stain. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the smell of cold ashes and gun oil. Christian hadn't slept. He knelt by the narrow slit in the heavy window shutter, his eye pressed to the gap. The Winchester rested on the sill. Beside him, tucked behind the thick timber wall, Addison sat with her knees drawn up, the Colt revolver heavy in her lap. She was shivering, though the stove in the corner was throwing a steady heat. It was the adrenaline. It was cold and chemical pooling in her stomach. Outside, the mountain was waking up. A crow called out from a dripping pine branch. Meltwater rushed in a steady, hushed roar down the ravines. Then the crow went violently silent. Christian's breathing slowed. His thumb found the hammer of the rifle. "They're here!" Addison scrambled to her knees, moving to her assigned spot behind the overturned oak table. She rested the barrel of the Colt on the edge of the wood, peering over the top. Her hands were slick with sweat. She wiped them one at a time on the rough canvas of her coat. Through the window slat, Christian watched the tree line. The trail narrowed there, choked by ancient towering spruce and massive granite boulders. It was a natural choke point. A shadow moved in the timber. Then a horse stepped out into the muddy clearing, its breath pluming in the damp air. The rider wore a heavy oilskin duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the morning mist. He held a repeating rifle across his saddle horn. Behind him, 2 more riders emerged, 3 men. Christian let out a slow, measured breath. He recognized the man in the lead. Harlan. He was a tracker from the lower basin, a man who charged by the day and enjoyed his work too much. Caldwell had sent his best hound. 3 of them, Christian murmured, not turning his head. "Wait until I fire. Don't waste your brass on the trees. Shoot only if they clear the tree line." Harlan reined his horse in, studying the cabin. He didn't look like a man expecting a fight. He looked like a man expecting an easy collection. He raised a hand, signaling the 2 men behind him to spread out. They urged their horses into the knee-deep slush, trying to flank the clearing. They were 50 yards out. Christian settled the front sight of the Winchester dead center on Harlan's chest. He didn't issue a warning. He didn't ask them to turn back. You didn't negotiate with a rattlesnake. You just took off its head. He squeezed the trigger. The cabin erupted in a deafening roar. The Winchester kicked against Christian's shoulder. Through the window gap, he saw Harlan violently jerk backward in the saddle. The man's rifle flew into the mud. His horse reared, screaming in panic, dumping Harlan into the slush with a heavy, wet thud. Chaos erupted. The other 2 riders spurred their horses behind the cover of the boulders, returning fire blindly. Bullets tore into the face of the cabin. Wood splintered. A heavy slug punched through the doorframe, showering the interior with sharp shards of oak. Addison ducked behind the table, covering her head as the noise washed over her. It wasn't like the practice in the clearing. It was terrifying, overwhelming violence. The air instantly filled with the acrid, choking stench of black powder. "Stay down," Christian barked, jacking the lever of the rifle. He fired twice more into the tree line, keeping them pinned. "Harlan's down," Christian yelled over the ringing in his ears. "But the other 2 are in the rocks. They're going to try to move up on foot." Silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. The only sound was the panicked whinny of Harlan's horse, running back down the trail. Then, the crunch of boots in the snow. One of the men broke from the rocks, sprinting low toward a cord of stacked firewood, about 20 yards from the porch. Christian tracked him, but the angle was wrong. The man slid behind the woodpile, instantly opening fire on the window. Bullets hammered the heavy wooden shutter. One found the narrow slat, ripping through the gap and burying itself in the ceiling beam above Christian's head. Showered with sawdust, Christian dropped below the sill. "He's pinned me on the left," Christian shouted. "Addison, the right window." Addison's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. Her vision narrowed to the small, dark rectangle of the firing slat on the right side of the door. She forced herself to crawl out from behind the table. Every instinct screamed at her to stay down, to hide. "If you hesitate, you die." Christian's voice echoed in her head. She pressed her back against the wall, reached up and unlatched the heavy wooden cover, pulling it back just an inch. She raised the heavy revolver. The second man was moving. He was trying to rush the porch from the right side, using a shallow dip in the terrain for cover. He was 20 yards out, boots churning to the mud, a 6-shooter in each hand. Addison cocked the hammer. Her hands were shaking so badly the barrel rattled against the wood. She closed her eyes. Don't pull. Squeeze. She opened her eyes, lined up the sights on the man's heavy coat, and pulled the trigger. The Colt roared. The recoil snapped her wrists back. She missed. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirty snow 3 feet to the man's left. He stopped, realizing he was being fired upon from a second angle, and snapped a shot toward her window. The glass pane above the slat shattered. Shards rained down on Addison's hair. She screamed, dropping the gun, and pressing her hands over her ears. Addison Christian roared. He lunged across the floorboards, abandoning his window. He grabbed the shotgun from the table. Stay down. He reached the door just as heavy boots hit the porch planks. The heavy oak door buckled violently as a boot kicked it from the outside. The iron bolt held, but the wood groaned in protest. Christian didn't wait for a second kick. He stepped back, leveled the double-barreled shotgun at the center of the door, and pulled the right trigger. The blast of buckshot tore a massive, jagged hole right through the center of the solid oak. A scream erupted from the other side, followed by the heavy sound of a body collapsing onto the porch boards. Christian didn't pause to admire his work. He spun back toward his window, dropping the shotgun and scooping up the Winchester. The man behind the woodpile was still out there. But as Christian raised his head to the firing slat, a figure vaulted over the porch railing. It was Harlan. He wasn't dead. Christian's first shot had hit him, but it hadn't stopped him. Harlan threw his weight against the shattered remnants of the door. The iron bolt, weakened by the shotgun blast, sheared off with a screech of tearing metal. The door burst inward, sagging off its hinges. Harlan filled the doorway. He was a massive man, his duster soaked with blood from a wound in his shoulder. His face was twisted in a rictus of pain and rage. He had a hunting knife in his good hand, the blade long and cruel. Christian swung the Winchester around, but Harlan was too fast. He lunged, driving his shoulder into Christian's chest. The rifle fired harmlessly into the floorboards as both men crashed onto the ground. They rolled a tangle of limbs and brutal momentum. Christian brought his knee up, catching Harlan in the ribs, but the larger man ignored the blow. Harlan pinned Christian's rifle arm beneath his knee and raised the knife high, aiming for Christian's throat. Christian caught Harlan's wrist with his free hand, his muscles straining against the immense, desperate weight of the tracker. The point of the knife trembled 2 inches from Christian's jugular. Blood dripped from Harlan's shoulder, pattering onto Christian's face. "She ain't worth it, mountain man." Harlan snarled, his breath foul with tobacco and blood. He drove his weight down, forcing the blade closer. Christian gritted his teeth, his arm trembling under the strain. He was losing leverage. The mud on Harlan's coat made him impossibly slick. 10 feet away, Addison uncurled from the floorboards. Her ears were ringing, her face scratched by the shattered glass. She saw Christian on the ground, struggling under the massive tracker. She saw the knife inching toward his throat. The panic evaporated. In its place, a sudden absolute clarity settled over her. She reached into the debris and grabbed the heavy barrel of the Colt. She thumbed the hammer back as she stood up. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She walked toward the 2 men, stopping 3 feet away. Harlan didn't even notice her. He was entirely focused on driving the steel into Christian's neck. Addison raised the revolver. She leveled it at the side of Harlan's head. "Hey," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Harlan's eyes flicked sideways. He saw the gun. He saw her face. The realization dawned too late. Addison squeezed the trigger. The gun went off with a sharp, concussive crack. Harlan's body went instantly slack. The terrible weight of his resistance vanished. He collapsed onto Christian like a felled tree, the knife clattering harmlessly against the floorboards. Silence rushed back into the cabin, heavy and ringing. The smoke from the black powder hung in the air like a thick, sulphurous fog. Outside, the third man had seen enough. The sound of a horse being spurred into a frantic gallop echoed down the muddy trail, fading quickly into the roar of the meltwater. He was gone. They had broken them. Christian shoved Harlan's heavy, lifeless body off him. He sat up his chest, heaving his face smeared with blood and sweat. He looked up at Addison. She was standing frozen, the smoking revolver hanging loosely at her side. She was staring at Harlan's body. Her chest rose and fell in short, jagged gasps. The shock was setting in, draining the color from her face until she was as pale as the day he had pulled her from the snow. Christian scrambled to his feet. He stepped over the body and went to her. "Give me the gun," he said softly. She didn't move. Her knuckles were white. Christian reached out, placing his hands gently over hers. He slowly pried her fingers from the grip, taking the weapon and tossing it onto the table. Then he wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her against his chest, tucking her head beneath his chin. She stood rigid for a second, fighting the reality of what she had just done before her knees gave out. Christian caught her weight sinking to the floor with her holding her tightly as she finally began to sob. It wasn't a delicate cry. It was a violent, wrenching sound tearing out of her throat. She gripped the front of his shirt, burying her face in his chest. "I've got you," Christian murmured into her hair. His own hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaving his system. He stroked her back, feeling the tremor in her spine. "You did what you had to do. I've got you." They sat there in the wreckage of the cabin, the cold spring air blowing through the shattered door. The blood on the floorboards belonged to the men who had come to take her, but the blood beating in their chests, frantic and alive, belonged only to them. Addison eventually pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She reached up her thumb, brushing a streak of Harlan's blood from Christian's cheekbone. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I'm alive." Christian corrected his voice, rough. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the woman who had dragged herself through a blizzard, the woman who had stood in the freezing snow to learn how to fight the woman who had just killed a man to save his life. He realized with a quiet, terrifying certainty that his mountain would never be just his again. He didn't want it to be. "We need to move the bodies," Christian said, gently breaking the silence, "before the wolves smell the blood." Addison swallowed hard, nodding slowly. She didn't look at the dead man on the floor. She looked only at Christian, drawing a deep, steadying breath. "Okay," she said. "Show me how." Death was heavy. It didn't just take a man's life. It seemed to add lead to his bones. It took both of them to drag Harlan out of the cabin. The porch boards, already slick with the meltwater, were treacherous with blood. Addison pulled by the dead man's heavy leather belt, while Christian, favoring his bruised ribs, hauled from the collar of the duster. They moved in grim silence, hauling Harlan and the man Christian had shot through the door across the clearing. They couldn't dig a proper grave. The ground beneath the top layer of slush was still frozen, solid, hard as iron. Instead, they dragged the bodies to a deep, rocky ravine 50 yards down the tree line. They rolled them over the edge. The bodies tumbled down the steep embankment, coming to rest in a tangle of scrub oak and jagged granite. Christian spent the next hour carrying heavy stones, dropping them over the corpses to keep the scavengers at bay until the spring thaw softened the earth. By the time they finished, the grey sky was darkening into a starless, bruised twilight. Addison walked back to the cabin like a ghost. Her clothes were stained with mud and rust-colored smears. She didn't stop at the porch. She went straight inside, filled a tin bucket from the water barrel, and set it on the stove. When Christian came in, carrying the shattered pieces of his oak door, she was already on her hands and knees with a scrub brush and a block of lye soap. She was scrubbing the floorboards where Harlan had died. Her movements were frantic, driven by a manic energy. Christian watched her for a moment. He set the wood down, grabbed a hammer and a handful of wrought iron nails, and began boarding up the ruined doorway. For an hour, the only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the hammer and the harsh, scraping hiss of the scrub brush. "The blood is gone, Addison," Christian finally said. She didn't stop. She dug the bristles into a crack in the wood. "It's in the grain. I can still see it." Christian set the hammer down. He crossed the room, knelt beside her on the wet floorboards, and put his hand over hers. The lye soap had turned her knuckles red and raw. "Stop," he said quietly. She froze. The manic energy drained out of her all at once, leaving a hollow, trembling shell. She dropped the brush into the bucket of murky grey water. "I killed a man," she whispered, staring at the wet floor. "I didn't even think about it. I just aimed and pulled." "You saved my life," Christian corrected his grip on her hand, firm. "You did what the mountain demanded. You survived." She looked up at him. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp hollows of her cheeks and the fading yellow bruise beneath her eye. "Does it get easier?" The quiet after. Christian thought about the men he had buried in his past, the fights in mining camps, the cattle wars down in the valley before he had retreated to the high country. "No," Christian said honestly. "It never gets easier, but it gets quieter. You learn to live with the ghosts." He stood up and pulled her to her feet. He brought her a dry towel. She wiped her hands, shivering in the draught that slipped through the gaps in the boarded-up door. "The third man," Addison said, looking toward the patched wood. "The one who rode away. He'll go straight to Caldwell. He'll tell him Harlan is dead." Christian walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of black coffee, handing her one. The heat radiated through the tin, warming her palms. "He will," Christian agreed. "Caldwell lost his best tracker and 2 hired guns. He knows you're up here, and he knows you're not an easy target anymore. He won't send 3 men next time. He'll send 10. He'll burn the forest down to smoke us out." Addison gripped the cup tighter. "Then I have to leave, tonight. I can cut north toward the Canadian border. If I'm gone, they have no reason to bother you. A woman alone on foot in the spring mud, running from a 10-man posse." Christian took a sip of his coffee. "You'd last a day. 2 if you're lucky. I am not letting you die for my ledgers, Christian." Her voice cracked, a sudden fierce flash of anger breaking through her exhaustion. Christian set his cup down on the table. He walked back to her, closing the distance until they were only inches apart. He looked down into her eyes, seeing the amber fire burning behind the fear. "You aren't letting me do anything," Christian said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I make my own choices, and I choose this." He reached up his rough, calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. It was a terribly intimate gesture, heavy with everything they hadn't said. Addison's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a fractured second. "We aren't staying here to wait for Caldwell's army," Christian said, dropping his hand, but not stepping back. "A defensive war is a losing war. If he wants the ledgers, we're going to give them to him." Addison's eyes snapped open, confusion clouding her face. "What, hand them over?" "Not to him." Christian said, a hard, cynical smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "The federal circuit judge rides into the Valley settlement next week. He brings a U.S. Marshal with him, a man named Beckett. Beckett doesn't care about Caldwell's cattle or his local sheriff. We take the books down the mountain right through Caldwell's front door, and we hand them to the feds. Caldwell will kill us before we reach the town limits. He'll try, Christian said. He turned and walked over to the gun rack, pulling down his gun belt. The heavy leather was worn smooth. But he expects us to hide. He expects us to run north or hole up in this cabin. He doesn't expect a dead woman and a mountain man to walk down the main street at high noon. He buckled the heavy belt around his waist, the Colt settling familiarly against his thigh. He looked back at her. "Pack your things, Addison. We ride at dawn." The descent was brutal. The mountain fought them every step of the way. Mudslides had erased parts of the trail, forcing Christian and Addison to dismount from the two sturdy pack mules Christian kept in a high meadow lean-to. They led the animals through waist-deep slush, slipping on hidden roots and loose shale. It took them 2 days to reach the valley floor. By the time the wooden facades of the settlement came into view, the mud on their clothes had dried into a pale, dusty crust. The town was a sprawling, ugly thing, built on railroad money and cattle blood. The main street was a wide avenue of churned earth, flanked by saloons, a bank, and a telegraph office. Christian halted his mule at the edge of town. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, resting it casually across his saddle horn. He looked at Addison. She sat tall on her mule, Christian's heavy coat draped over her shoulders. Beneath the canvas, he knew a leather satchel containing the ledgers was strapped tightly across her chest. "You ready?" he asked. She looked at the town, her jaw set. "No, but let's go anyway." They rode down the center of the main street. They didn't hurry. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. Heads began to turn. A woman walking out of the mercantile dropped her basket. A pair of cowhands lounging outside the saloon stood up their hands, drifting instinctively toward their belts. The whispers started instantly. They recognized the woman who had supposedly stolen from Emmett Caldwell and vanished into the winter. And they recognized the massive bearded man riding beside her, a man the valley folks usually only saw once a year when he came down to trade pelts. They reached the front of the telegraph office. Next door was the temporary marshal's station, a wooden sign nailed over a boarding house door. Christian dismounted. He tied his mule to the hitching post, then stepped over to help Addison down. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice cut through the street traffic like a cracking whip. Christian turned slowly. Stepping off the boardwalk of the bank across the street was Emmett Caldwell. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and a silver belly hat, but his face was bruised purple with fury. Flanking him were 4 men, heavily armed, their dusters swept back to reveal tied-down holsters. Caldwell strode into the muddy street, stopping 20 feet away. He ignored Christian, entirely locking his eyes on Addison. "I sent good men up that mountain to fetch you Addison," Caldwell said. His voice was smooth-cultured, but laced with poison. "I hear they ran into some trouble." "They ran into a shotgun," Christian said loudly, ensuring half the street could hear him. "Left them for the wolves." Caldwell's eyes flicked to Christian. He sneered. "I don't know you, mountain man, but you've made a fatal error in judgment. Step aside. The girl stole property from my bank. She's coming with me." "She isn't going anywhere with you," a new voice boomed. The door to the boarding house swung open. A man stepped out onto the porch, pinning a silver star to his vest. Marshal Beckett was older, with silver hair and a face carved from granite. He held a double-barreled scattergun pointed loosely at the mud in front of Caldwell's boots. Caldwell stiffened. "Marshal, this is a local matter. The woman is a thief." "She's a witness," Addison said. She stepped out from behind Christian. Her voice didn't shake. It rang out clear and hard. She unbuttoned the canvas coat and pulled the heavy leather satchel over her head, holding it up. These are the true ledgers, Marshal. They document every forged deed, every bribe, and every cent Mr. Caldwell stole from the federal land grants. The silence on the street was absolute. Caldwell's face went pale. The cultured veneer cracked. "Kill them!" he screamed at his men. "Shoot them both!" The men hesitated. They were hired guns used to intimidating farmers and shooting mechanics in the back. They looked at Christian, who had leveled the Winchester dead at Caldwell's chest. They looked at Marshal Beckett, who cocked both hammers of the shotgun. And they looked at Addison, who stood her ground, a Colt Navy revolver, suddenly drawn and aimed flawlessly at Caldwell's face. "Drop 'em," Christian said. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a cold, absolute promise of death. "First man who clears leather dies before his gun clears the holster." Nobody moved. The tension stretched thin and vibrating. Slowly the man nearest to Caldwell raised his hands, stepping back. "I ain't dying over a ledger, Emmett." One by one, the other 3 men backed away, lowering their hands. Caldwell stood alone in the mud. The empire he had built on fear and violence evaporated in the span of 30 seconds, dismantled by a woman he thought he could break, and a man who refused to be moved. "Emmett Caldwell," Marshal Beckett said, stepping off the porch. "You are under arrest for federal fraud, extortion, and attempted murder." "Turn around." Caldwell looked at Addison. The hatred in his eyes was absolute. But he raised his hands and turned around. The breath rushed out of Addison all at once. She lowered the revolver, her arms suddenly feeling like lead. Christian stepped close to her, putting a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he murmured. 2 hours later, they sat on the wooden bench outside the telegraph office. The ledgers were secured in a federal lockbox. Caldwell was in chains awaiting the transport wagon to Helena. The sun was breaking through the grey clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the muddy street. Addison looked at her hands. They were clean now, but the calluses from chopping wood and gripping a rifle remained. She wasn't the clerk who had fled up the mountain. The fire had forged her into something else entirely. "Beckett says I need to go to Helena to testify," Addison said softly, staring at the street. "After that, I have the reward money from the federal grants. I could go east, start over." Christian sat beside her, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked up at the towering peaks of the Bitterroots in the distance. The snow was melting, revealing the dark, jagged pines. It was his home. It was silent, brutal, and honest. But as he looked at the mountain, he realized the silence there would be deafening without her. "You could go east," Christian agreed slowly. He turned his head to look at her. "Or you could buy a decent winter coat. A coat that actually fits." Addison turned to him. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, lighting up her eyes. The haunted shadows were finally gone. "I'd need someone to show me how to track in the snow," she said quietly. "I know a guy," Christian replied, the corner of his mouth turning up into a rare, devastating smile. He reached out, taking her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined rough skin against calluses anchored together by the weight of what they had survived. They sat on the bench as the valley bustled around them, 2 survivors ready to face the mountain together. The thaw has finally come, melting away the winter's cruelty and leaving behind a bond forged in fire and ice. Christian and Addison survived the blizzard, the bullets, and the ghosts of the past. If this gritty, grounded tale of frontier survival